We're going to talk very briefly about some characteristics common in Victorian literature. And as you read your books this month, I want you to kind of keep these in the back of your mind and be looking for them. Not every book is going to have every characteristic, but these are things that were common at the time. So you'll be able to find at least one, if not more than that, as you're reading. So one characteristic common in Victorian literature is the inclusion of industrialization and how that affects characters. This was an interesting time in history in the 1800s where there were manufacturing booms. With the advent of coal burning, they were able to have more flexibility with where they built their factories. They didn't have to stick to rivers so that they could use water wheels, and they were able to build more factories in different places, and this created more jobs and new opportunities, and of course also challenges. As railroads were built, then formerly isolated towns were now much more easily able to branch out and connect to other cities and people. And so there was a big shift in communities at this time, and how people thought of the world, right? It became a little bit bigger. But obviously it was very different, right? So for example, in Elizabeth Gaskell's book, North and South, she set up this problem right in the title, North and South, right? That contrast. And she talked about the South as being the cultured life of London, and the North was this up and coming industrial town. And so you can imagine what happens when a nice Southern girl from this cultured life goes to the North and confronts this kind of bleak life with factories and clouds of coal smoke and not all of the sophisticated old money ways that she was used to in London. So as you're reading your book, some things to keep in mind. How does industrialization at this time in history affect the lives of the characters in the novel? Are they traveling via train? Are they a child who is working, as factories increased in number, there were more jobs and the workers got younger and younger? Do you see any of that in your book? Does anybody have a new factory job, and how is it? What conditions were there? Another characteristic of Victorian literature is social class structure. Many Victorians were super status conscious. They thought a lot about who they were in relation to who everyone else was. And you'll see this particularly in books by like Jane Austen. A classic example of this is Mrs. Bennet, who kind of behind the scenes wants to find out everything she can about people. And so between the working class and the upper crust, there was the catch-all middle class. And with the middle class growing in the 19th century, now it's not so simple to keep track of, right? So some people felt the need to try and classify people, right? They're not just upper class or lower class, but, are they old money where their family has been well off for generations? Or are they new money because they did something new and exciting and beneficial to them, right? How much money did people make per year? Did they have their own parlors or their own carriages? What did they do for a living? And sometimes it was considered, socially inappropriate to ask people those things directly. And so they gossiped a lot and tried to find out about people kind of behind the scenes. And so some ways that you might see this in your book, you might notice that certain people have their relationships affected by this. They can or can't be friends with or date certain people because of their social standing. Or, it might be a really big deal to them to make a new friend from perhaps a different social circle. So you may have heard of Charles Darwin before. his theories of evolution and this idea of survival of the fittest were relatively new at this time in history. And so writers began incorporating these concepts into their writing, kind of addressing the idea that you have to be strong in order to succeed. And so you might have a book where a character is in a real struggle for survival. I think of like Black Beauty, where this horse is in some really terrible situations. But you have to be strong, you have to be creative, have ingenuity, or maybe just luck in order to survive. And they include this idea that sometimes the world or nature just seems to be against them. Things are just hard. So in your book, you might consider which characters are struggling for survival. And maybe it's not just like to live, but to live well or to live how they want, or something along those lines. How do they show that they are or are not strong enough to survive and overcome the obstacles that nature or that society has presented them with? Another characteristic of Victorian literature is this idea of progress or moving up in the world. During the Victorian era, the country, England, most of these are set there, was generally very financially well off. And a lot of people believed that that was thanks to their like moral goodness and righteousness, that because they were such good people, God had blessed them. And so their country was doing well. There was a growing divide, or quite a divide, between the upper class and the lower class. And a lot of people loved this idea of a growing middle class and people kind of working hard and progressing and moving up in the world and making something of themselves. Politically, the middle class was fighting for more control. They wanted everyone, or at least more people, to be able to vote. They were fighting for more rights, and everything was getting very regulated. The number of hours that they could work in a week, or how much control women had over money and property, and of course voting rights. All of those things were kind of moving to the forefront of people's thoughts. There was a lot of reform going on in the country at the time. So as you're reading your book, you might see evidence of progress in your novel. Is somebody moving up socially or financially? Are people fighting for rights or talking about how maybe they're unsettled by their lack of rights? Does there seem to be a lot of patriotism for their country? You'll see this in different ways. In Pride and Prejudice, for example, the Bennet family has 5 daughters, and women weren't allowed to hold property. And so they know that after their father dies, they'll all effectively be homeless. The home that they have grown up in will be passed along in ownership to a male relative. And that has to do with their rights as women at the time. And so, that affects how they view marriage and the opportunities that they had available to them at that time because of the restrictions that were in place. Social criticism is an interesting one. So if we look back at this time in history, there were, a variety of issues going on, and both politicians and concerned citizens were interested in trying to improve conditions for London and Londoners, and novelists, authors, also wanted to get involved in the cause. And so you'll notice in many of these books that are set in or around London especially, they describe the city in not always complimentary ways. So they'll talk about the mazy streets, the mud, the fog. They'll talk about it like it's slums. People are dirty or sad, or the sky is dark, or things like that. It's not always, cute. And so why were they doing this? They were encouraging people to acknowledge that everything wasn't perfect. They're moving out of this sort of romantic era where let's just talk about how wonderful everything is, and let's actually notice that, yeah, there are some issues, and those issues won't get better until people fight to make them better, right? So for example, Charles Dickens, and some of you will be reading books by him, he's really famous for his descriptions of these sort of slummy urban scenes. Um, there's fog, all of that. It's not just description, but it's also a symbol. It's in fog, hard to see where you're going, right? And similarly, Dickens is asking society, he's asking readers, people to do something about the dirtiest parts of the dirty city. Like, let's acknowledge that there are issues and let's try to improve them. And so you'll notice in some of your books that the author is criticizing something about their society. They're pointing out, look at these amazing female characters who don't have the same rights as men. Or look at this amazing child character who, is homeless or is orphaned or is forced into child labor. Let's look at these issues in our society. And then sometimes they also imply suggestions for what needs to change or how these things could be improved. And we've already touched on the idea of women's rights. So it's not that people had never thought about giving women increased rights or new things, but it just traditionally at that time was kind of expected that women did not receive the same educations as men, that they sort of topped out academically at some point and then were only offered instruction in the finer or more delicate arts like drawing and music and things like that. The expectation was that women, wherever possible, would get married and then they would be housewives and take care of the house and the kids. And not that there's anything wrong with those, but they didn't have opportunities to do other things if they wanted, right? So depending upon class, there were certain things that were available to them. Working class women could be seamstresses and work in, factories or dressmaking or things like that. Middle class women could pretty much like be a governess and teach children or take care of children, or they could write, but not very many options available to them. So as you're reading your book, think about, does your novel present women in traditional roles? Because they only had so many possibilities open to them at the time, right? Or are they trying to do something different? Regardless of what they're doing, even if they are in a traditional role, do there seem to be strong female characters? Maybe there's a mother or a fiance or a governess, things that were sort of expected at the time, but who's talking about bigger ideas or possibilities or things that she'd like to do that maybe weren't expected at the time. Authors at this time were using their writing to present women as more than just an object, as real people who were smart and capable of making good decisions when voting and capable of holding other occupations than what traditionally had been expected of them. Some of these books, thinking of books like The Railway Children, Alice in Wonderland, and The Adventures of Robin Hood, some of these were written specifically for and or about children. And the idea of writing novels for and about children grew a lot during the Victorian era. That had not been common prior to this era. And so there was this growing market of fiction for kids. The idea of having illustrations in books was becoming more and more common. And the primary goal of a lot of children's literature at this time was to teach morals in kind of a fun way. So you might be looking for, if your book was seemed to be written for or about children, and if so, what does it show about kids? Does it show them overcoming things that were difficult or that are often difficult for kids? Does it teach a moral using a child protagonist? Something like that would have been very common at the time. And the last characteristic we're going to talk about today is utilitarianism. And this basically means what will make the most people the most happy. So when you're making a decision, do you base that solely on what you want to do? Or do you base that on what is going to positively impact the people around you? So for example, if you're thinking about what to do after school, should you just go home and eat whatever you want and watch TV because that's going to make you happy? Or should you volunteer at a community center or a senior center or something like that, because it might improve other people's days. Should you go home and do something nice for your family, like make them dinner or bake cookies, right? Um, and so it's this idea of, when we make decisions, what do we base that on? So in your books, you might see characters that seem to base their decision making on what will make other people happy rather than just what they want to do or what will make them happy. And this is kind of an ethical philosophy. And so, are they struggling with ethics? Like, what is the right thing to do? What is the best thing to do? So in your book, you're going to look for one of these. You might find 2 or 3 or 4, and that's fine. You might brainstorm a few and then choose the one that you can write the most about. But in your report this month, you're going to write 1 paragraph about one of these and really focus on how you see that. How do you see the idea of women's rights? Is the author presenting this strong female character? And what makes you say that about her? Use the guiding questions that I put on the bottom of the slides, so that if you identify utilitarianism, you can talk about which character seems to be making a decision based upon what's going to make the most people happy, for example. Hope that helps, and I hope you enjoy your books this month.